Uliaka mauna vela ikeahi. Uliaka mauna vela ikeahi.
Thanks, Kenzie. You're welcome. Appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. I see we not only have a bunch of Australians, they must be Catholics as well because I see them all in the back. What Kenzie didn't mention to you is that I also studied to be a priest for 8 years. I left home when I was 13 and studied with the Franciscans for 4 years and then also with the Jesuits for another 4 years before moving to the South Pacific for a short while and continuing my education there. Most of the work that I do is focused on Pacific Rim cultures, but I also lecture on ancient cultures around the world, from the Baltic states to the Mediterranean to ancient Africa, Asian, you name it. If it's in mythology, chances are I've studied a bit about it. It's really a passion, primarily because what I really try to do with the lectures is to help people understand a little bit better where we're going, what we're seeing, and the importance of religion and mythology as it's fused throughout almost every part of our world. What we sometimes fail to recognize is that when we're looking at as a physical structure, whether it be the ocean or an island, a volcano, a type of tree, is that the ancients looked at these as messages from the God. They created mythologies to help them understand where they came from, who they were, what was important to them. So these are the important things that we'll be talking about today. Would be the stories of Hawaii, land, and her people. First of all, I see that we have how many Americans do we have in the crowd here today? Okay, a few. Quite a few Australians. And there we go, all the Aussies are here today. Great. I also came with, my date for the cruise is my 86-year-old father. He's sitting back up here. My family, my wife and my kids were not thrilled that I was going to be leaving them for 3 weeks, but it was under two conditions: that if I was going with Grandpa, it was going to be okay, and as long as I got back before October 14th, which is my son's 11th birthday. So, as Kinsey mentioned, I live in Costa Rica. I was a travel writer for many years. I started my advertising agency in Chicago and decided I wasn't able to make nearly enough money to travel and see the world from my advertising agency, and recognized that travel writers lived a pretty decent life. So I started doing travel writing and then eventually moved into using my degree to lecture. So what we'll talk about now is, we'll walk you through a little bit about the importance of myth. What is a myth? A myth really helps us understand who we are, where we come from. It's a story that we create, and from the earliest days, it helps us create an understanding of our surroundings. So consider the earliest man. We had very little understanding of our world, the sun, the moon, the stars, all of the things that surrounded us, and yet we recognized the importance of these things in our lives and how these things shaped our very existence. So instead of just recognizing them as things that they didn't understand, with no meaning and no basis in their understanding, they created stories to help them understand who they are, where they came from, and the importance of the land that surrounds them. So, a myth is a story that answers fundamental questions that people ask. Instead of, this is before science. So really today when we talk about myth, we ask about who and what am I? Where did I come from? Why am I here? These were all the questions that mythology tried to answer for the ancient people. They also tried to answer, how should I live? So this is a moral code. And the earliest peoples didn't have a moral code. These weren't things where they recognized the inherent value and dignity in a human life. Cannibalism was rampant. So a lot of these stories help them understand, how should I act? How should I comport myself? And most importantly to understand is that these mythologies were generally created by the most powerful chieftains, by the rulers of the tribe, and they were created for a couple of simple reasons. Number one, to help them get an understanding of the world in which they lived, but more importantly for the chieftains and for the people in charge of the society, was that they created these mythologies to govern people. It was a source of rules, a source of laws that helped people understand how they should comport themselves in a society. In much the same way that religions do today, mythologies were the precursors. They were the first steps to the religions that we know today. Every religion has a basis in mythology. And what I'll try to show you through some of these lectures, we don't get into a lot of Judeo-Christian mythology and parts of the religious faith, but what I'll try to do is to show you how all of these faiths are connected and some theories as to why they're connected. Almost every religion includes one of the following: the creation of the world. They wanted to understand how the world came into being, why it's important to them. The first man and the first woman. Almost every mythology has a story about the first man and woman created. Heaven and earth. They knew the difference between the skies and the earth. They wanted to understand and explain why. A great flood. This one is probably the most interesting of all of them. We can understand why people would want to talk about the creation of the world, creation of the first woman and man, stories of heaven and earth. But why is a flood mythology important? A flood mythology gives them an idea and helps them understand the power of God. That if they don't live properly, if they don't comport themselves as they should according to the laws, that the gods up above have every opportunity to come down and wipe the slate clean all over again. So if in fact the laws in their tribes weren't working, the threat and the idea that God can come down and wipe out all of creation and start over again was enough to scare them into doing right again. Another interesting piece of mythology that's present almost across every single ancient indigenous group is a resurrection story. And what we'll show you even in the mythologies of Hawaii is that you'll find that there will be a god or a demigod who is born to a woman who is unsuspecting of the divinity of her child. She doesn't discover the divinity of her child until much later on. And then when this child dies, the child comes back to life again. That you really can't kill this child. Even though the body may be dead, that the spirit lives on. So this idea of resurrection also confers to us that what these cultures were interested in was the idea that something exists beyond themselves, beyond the world that they know, that there's something that exists beyond their life. And it gave them a reason not to be afraid of death, because every culture fears death. So the idea of a resurrection story not only helps us understand how we can live better, but also that there's something beyond as a reward for those who do choose to live better. Or there is a life beyond for those who choose not to live better as well. So myth was early man's philosophy and science. The same questions that our religions and mythologies used to answer very basically, our science now do. Now we're understanding quantum physics. We understand how the world was created with geology. We understand more and more how our world was created. But myths answer these very earliest questions. Myths also cast a light on the culture's shared unconscious. How many of you are familiar with Sigmund Freud? Carl Jung was another psychologist, psychiatrist in this era. And what he really wanted to help people understand, what he believed intrinsically, was very much what we would call instinct today. So if you look at instinct among animals, we would say that a jaguar instinctively knows how to hunt. It instinctively knows how to hunt its prey and how to live its life. What Carl Jung would say is that throughout humanity, that there are things in the back of our minds called archetypes, that it's the thread that binds all of human history, that every single generation adds to our subconscious, to our unconscious, these ideas that we need to know. Ideas that are intrinsic to us as human beings. So the ideas that these stories, the same flood stories, the same creation stories, the same resurrection stories are present across almost every mythology and present across almost every religion, he would say that's not a coincidence. Now, he wouldn't go as far as to calling it God's revelation, but he would say is that there's something in our minds that we're pre-programmed to believe that there's something greater than ourselves, that there's something beyond ourselves, and that the idea of archetype theory is that there are stories that exist in the back of our minds, and that every single generation continues to add to those archetypes. We continue to add to the stories of our people. And so that as the people spread across the world, these stories spread with them. And the stories then became a reflection not only of the archetypes of the things that we've collectively gathered throughout human history, but also a reflection of our own culture. So while the stories are unique to each culture, they're also the same across every culture. Sometime not too long ago, the idea of myth came into our vocabulary not as something of a precursor to religion, but the idea is that a myth is an untrue story. The reason this word came into being is likely because the missionaries, when they came with talk of their religions, heard all of the stories of the myths. And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to categorize this as untrue. So what they did was they said mythology is all those things that are untrue. They're the stories that help us understand, but they're untrue. And yet religion is truth. So what I would like us to do today is to help us better understand that a myth really is the seed to all of religion. And when we think about the diversity of mythology, I ask people to think about a painting that has one color. You can look at it, maybe you might be able to appreciate it for a short while. But the simple truth is that a one-color painting has a lack of dimension. It has a lack of depth. It has a lack of significance for most people. And in the same way with religion and diversity, religion and mythology, that the beauty of mythology is its rich diversity. That the reason we enjoy mythology today is because there's such variation across the world, that while there's similarities, we can appreciate the differences that each unique culture brings to the table. So let's talk a little bit about the mythologies of Hawaii. The beginning. This is a beautiful photo, doctored to show the actual depth of the islands. But what I'd like to talk about is, the creation story. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little bit because I want to start to talk a little bit about the variations of the story and to see the similarities. So, in the ancient Hawaiian world, there was a great darkness, and this darkness was called Po. This was before the memory of all humankind. So again, this is an interesting story. And they start the story by explaining that the only way that we know this is because it came to us through our chieftains who passed it down through the generations. But it was a time of deep, deep darkness before the memory of humankind. So there's no way that anyone else can know this except the people who have this story passed down through the gods. So into this void came Kane. Kane is the god of creation. Now, from those of you who are from New Zealand, the god in New Zealand is Tane Mohuta. Here, they changed the T's to the K's, so it became Kane. He picked up a giant calabash, like a pumpkin or a gourd, and he threw the pumpkin into the air, the calabash into the air, and it split into two pieces. The one piece became the sky, the other piece became the earth. Now the names for these are Rangi, which is the sky father, and Papa, which is the earth mother. So these two were created. And he gave to the god Kanaloa the dominion of the seas. Now Kane decided that he didn't want to be responsible for maintaining the earth, for caring for it. So he decided he wanted to create a great chief that would oversee the earth. So he set out to the other gods to tell them to find the materials to build this new great chief that would rule the earth. And while they were out looking for that, he filled the earth with living things. Now this is a very unique piece of Hawaiian mythology and Polynesian mythology that no other culture examines. But he said that Kane filled the world with caterpillars to make moths and butterflies, and he filled the earth with eggs, which would hatch into birds and creatures of every sort. So for those of you who are wondering which came first, the chicken or the egg, the Polynesians have answered that story for you. He didn't create the living creatures and the birds first. He created the eggs so that from the eggs, all life could come. And that's an interesting story. They understood the importance of the egg and the life-giving nature of the egg and its importance not only to their culture, but also in the earliest drawings of the world, most of us would understand that until a couple of hundred years ago, a few hundred years ago, most of the world thought that the world was flat. But the Polynesians actually believed that the earth was either round or egg-shelled, that it was egg-shaped. So they were much ahead of the rest of the world thinking that the world was flat. They understood the world to be a place being round. And so when we talk about the gourd or the calabash that was thrown into the sky, this is their understanding as well, that the earth was a round place. So he gave dominion to create the trees, to create all of the living creatures. And then when they were finished with all of the creation, it took 2 days for the creation. When the creation was finished, he said, "Now where are the materials for my great chief?" And so they brought to him this beautiful red earth. And they created from this red earth the first man. He fashioned the earth into the man shape. And then, very interesting, what they recognized was most important was to animate it. He breathed life into it. Now think of the similarities in that story. Thousands of years apart, thousands of miles apart, and yet the stories are so similar to our own. When he woke up, what the great chief realized was that he was lonely. While he had all of this beautiful creation around him, he didn't have someone to share it with. So Kane, the great god, understood this, and while he slept at night, Kane reached inside and pulled out and fashioned a woman. There are two different ways that people tell this story from ancient Polynesia. One was that he removed the woman from the man. Another was that he took parts of the man to create the woman. But in any respect, what they wanted people to understand was that they were coming from the same flesh. They were meant for each other. And so he set the woman by the side of the man and took pleasure in the fact that they were alike. What was interesting about this is that the man woke up the next day and then realized that something was missing from inside of him that would now be completed by his presence with this woman. And it's a very interesting story. And they actually call the ancient word for woman is ka'akahulilani, which means heaven changed into shadow. So the first time when they talk about some of the other older stories of Polynesian mythology, they say that the man was actually walking around, and while he was walking around, he noticed that there was a shadow. And so he looked on the side and he saw that this shadow was his aka. And it was this aka then that Kane decided to turn into his spouse, into the woman. So there's several different stories, all of them very similar. The one with the shadow was probably the most unique. And it's very intriguing to consider how these stories developed thousands of years apart. So when we think about the similarities, we say, it seems so familiar. And when we see the photos, when we see the paintings that they created to express their creation story, how similar these pictures are to each other. In some of my writings, what I talk about as with my religious background in the seminary, talk about God's revelation. For those of you who believe that this is a theologian's opportunity to discuss the evolution of God's revelation, what I do is I talk a little bit about a painting, and I ask people to look at this beautiful painting. And for me, when I hear about these wonderful stories of mythology, each culture paints one stroke on this amazing canvas of God's revelation. And we're so close to that painting, we're so close to our own brushstroke that we can't see all of the other brushstrokes. We can't see the painting in its fullness. So it's only in taking a step back and recognizing the beauty and the diversity of mythology and all of the stories that God has tried to reveal himself to us in ways that we would best understand. To the earliest people, God would reveal himself to the forces of through the forces of nature. It was what they understood, through the sun, through the moon, through the oceans, through nature itself. And then as we became more interdependent, what God did was he sent prophets, he sent other people to help them understand the importance of these stories. He helped them understand their connection to God. So what we often talk about in the theology world is that Revelation is a grand painting, and that the way we can appreciate the beauty of this painting is by taking a step back from our own brushstroke, our own beliefs, and trying to see the incredible broad sweep of God's revelation throughout all of humanity. So this is just one way to see mythology. Now we'll talk a little bit about the specific mythologies of Hawaii. How many have heard of Maui? Well, the island of Maui in Hawaii is actually named after the demigod Maui. Maui actually has a very similar story to that of Moses, for those of you who are familiar with the story of Moses. While Moses was given up by his mother and sent down the Nile in a basket of reeds, Maui, when he was born, he was the fifth son, they thought he was too weak to even live. So the mother actually cut out a top knot from her hair, which was a sacred top knot from a woman's hair, and she put it in a little basket with the baby and sent him out to the ocean, thinking that he would die and that the ocean would claim his spirit. So these very similar stories. And then what happens is someone finds him and raises him, and he becomes this great demigod. But it's only later when he meets his mother that it's revealed the entire story. Throughout almost all of mythology, in Greek and Roman mythology, the ancient Baltic mythologies and African mythologies, the same story exists that ties this great, great man to a story that foreshadows he didn't seem like much. He seemed average. He seemed normal. But then when we see the whole story unveiled, we recognize that this is indeed a great man and a man chosen by God. So, the story of Maui fishing up the islands. This is the same story that exists almost throughout all of Polynesia, but it's most readily adapted from Hawaiians and also in New Zealand. Maui is credited with pulling up the islands of the Hawaiian chain. So he was out with his brothers. His brothers didn't like him to come out fishing because he was an awful fisherman. He would often go out with his brothers, and while they weren't looking, he would steal the fish from their lines and keep them for himself. So he was a trickster and is known throughout all of mythology as one of the great tricksters. But one day, Maui wanted to go out so desperately with his brothers to prove himself that he made them a promise. He said, I can catch the great ulua, which was this huge fish, this mythical fish that no one had ever seen. Well, the brothers didn't believe him, but they invited him out anyways to prove him wrong. So Maui had brought along with him a piece of bone from his grandmother's jaw, and it was shaped like a hook. So he threw this hook over the edge of the boat, and he waited. And he waited. Meanwhile, his brothers taunted him, told him that he wasn't going to catch anything, and then he felt this big pull. And he kept on pulling and pulling and pulling, and eventually he brought up the Hawaiian island chain. Now, there's another story that goes along with this. It says that the Hawaiian island chain is shaped like a wing, and it's from the volcanic formations over millions of years. But in ancient mythology, they thought that this was actually a wing of a bird. And so there was the story about Hina, she was underneath the waters, and that while Maui was pulling this bird up from the ocean, she was trying to pull it back down. And so she pulled the entire bird back down, but the wing broke off. And so the wing came up, but as it was rising up, it was bleeding. And so consequently, we see all of the red soil and the volcanic ash. We see all the red of the islands. But while it was being brought up, the fish came and started chewing at this wing. And so instead of seeing an entire wing, what came up was just the pieces of the wing. And so the pieces of the wing now are the Hawaiian Islands. And that's the story of how Maui brought up the Hawaiian Islands. So for those of you who have seen in the stores, for those of you from New Zealand, it's very common to see with the Maoris, and also in most of Polynesia, you'll see the fish hook. And the fish hook is actually called Te Ika a Maui, which is the fish hook of Maui. And there's actually a part in New Zealand that very place is called Te Ika a Maui, which is the place that's designated that when they brought up the island, that what remained in this one area was the fish hook from Maui. Here's some fast facts about the Polynesians. Ancient Polynesians were Stone Age. They had absolutely no metals. Now, while Polynesians were not inventive, so they didn't really create or invent anything like a lot of ancient cultures, they were very imaginative. So they spent their times creating the stories about their understandings of where they live. But this was a culture that developed with no tools, no metals. We consider them pre-literate because they also had no alphabet. They didn't have any use of the wheel, and they had almost minimal use of clay or pottery. It was only the later Polynesian tribes that had the Lapita people, if you've heard, came from Asia, and they brought with them a pottery style that can be traced throughout all of the Polynesian islands in the South Pacific. And yet, even though they were not an advanced culture, they explored the Earth's largest ocean and progressed beyond mere survival to create a culture of surprising affluence and complexity. And also consider that they had done all of this thousand years before the first Europeans ever set forth from their shores. So when we think of the incredible expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the idea that these people were able to find these islands is nothing short of a miracle. When you take a look at the actual size of the ocean and see the dots that these islands represent, and to think that people left from thousands of miles and traveled and were able to find them, it's quite astonishing. So now we'll talk a little bit about Captain Cook and his arrival in Hawaii. Captain Cook arrived in 1779. When he arrived, the population on the islands of Hawaii was about 400,000 to 800,000 people. By 100 years later, that population was reduced to 40,000. So it was 1/10 at the very minimum of the size it was when Cook first found it. They died from venereal disease, tuberculosis, and other diseases that they had absolutely no chance against. So when the Europeans came over, they not only brought with them their culture and their civilization and their ideas, they also brought with them a great deal of disease that almost decimated the people of Hawaii. So now we'll talk a little bit about the discoverers of Hawaii. Hawaii was discovered in 450 BC by Polynesians, probably from the South Pacific. What we know is that there were a succession of cultures that actually defined what is Hawaii today. But most of what we know of Hawaii comes to us from Tahiti, from the earliest people from the Marquesas, who were the first people who came and settled Hawaii. When they came, they stayed for a few hundred years, but then when the Tahitians came up, they destroyed everything of the ancient culture that was existing. They not only decimated it, but they enslaved the people that were there. So, how do they find the Hawaiian Islands? They would notice in the South Pacific, they would notice that every spring, birds would come and they would migrate to the north. They had no idea where they were going, but they also knew that these birds couldn't swim, they couldn't fly forever. So they figured that there must be some places in the water for these birds to land along the way. So what they did was they set out in their outrigger canoes with as much as they possibly could carry, and they set out looking for new worlds. They were also led by the clouds. For those of you from New Zealand, you know that the word for New Zealand is Aotearoa in Maori, which means land of the long white cloud. And so this long white cloud and the clouds above these islands were often the ways that the Polynesians were able to find that there was a landmass. So miles and miles before they could see the actual island itself, they would see a gathering of clouds. And they would be able to tell then that by these clouds, that there was land beneath it, because the volcanoes and the mountains had actually stopped the clouds from moving. And so that's how they were able to follow and find the land masses in the North Pacific. And as I mentioned, it would be 1,000 years before the Vikings would ever venture away from Europe's shores. So it gives you an idea of how long ago and how advanced this culture was. Now we'll talk a little bit about Pele. Many of you are familiar with Pele as the goddess of the volcanoes. Well, Pele is also recognized for her furious temper. And the reason that Pele comes to Hawaii is because she was kicked out of the South Polynesian Islands by her father. Her father had gotten tired of her temper, and so he said, Pele, get out of here. Kicked her out of the house, and so she went looking in search of a new home. And as a girl with younger sisters, it will often happen, her younger sister followed her. So we have two opposites. We have Pele, who is the goddess of fire, and then her sister, who is the goddess of rain and waters. So everywhere that Pele would go, her sister would follow her and put out her fires. So Pele would go to one island and would start a volcano, start the fires. Her sister would come and extinguish it right away. She'd go to the next island and start it. Her sister would come and extinguish it. And it's this way that Polynesians came to understand their tropical island heritage, their tropical island geography. That it started with this wonderful volcanic formation, and in the end, what would happen is the rains would come, would put out all of the fires, and the beautiful lush greenery would grow. How many of you have heard of the Curse of Pele? No one? The Curse of Pele is, for those of you who have, let me ask this question first. Did anyone on Hawaii take any volcanic stones or any sand from the beach to put in your bag? No. Every once in a while we'll find a couple of people who do this and they don't like what I'm about to tell them. There's actually a curse known as the Curse of Pele. And the Curse of Pele is that if you take any volcanic rocks from the islands of Hawaii or any sand from a volcanic origin, that you'll be cursed and that often within 7 days you will die. So millions of people throughout the years have taken sand and stones from the islands of Hawaii, and they're not sure if this story is an actual legend or a myth. They believe that it was actually created probably in the 1950s by a man working for the Park Service who continued to see people as they were walking around, reaching down and picking up a stone and quick putting it in their pocket. So the story goes that this man actually created the story of the Curse of Pele, but there are actually websites that exist there when you can go and find this. People talk about how they've been cursed by Pele. And for those, how many of you remember the show The Brady Bunch? Did you see okay, so they had it in Australia too. Well, I remember growing up and seeing that story, and one of the episodes is that the boys found this little tiki god that belonged to one of the great priests in history, one of the great tribal chieftains. And so they had to return this to its rightful place. And this is actually a place where people who take those stones, they send them back to the postal service from around the world every year. There's actually one man in Hawaii whose job is to collect the stones and the sand and to take them to this place to unleash the curse of Pele, so that the curse will no longer be in effect on these people. But literally, and this is without exaggeration, thousands and thousands, each year hundreds of thousands of stones are returned by the U.S. Postal Service from people who will mail them to post office in Honolulu, Hawaii, that they have an actual room that's filled with stones that's emptied on a regular basis and taken to this very place to lift the curse of Pele. So while one man's story was very well received, sadly for the Postal Service, it ends up costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars each year to store and to take these stones back to the place where they came from. I was going to show you a little bit of the Brady Bunch, but we don't have much time. Plus, there's some great fun stories that you see on their week or 2-week trip to Hawaii. So now we'll talk a little bit about the conquest of Hawaii. As we mentioned, they were from the Marquesas, but everything that we know about them was obliterated by the people who came later. They came from the islands of Raiatea, Bora Bora, and Wahine. So you can see here, On the right-hand side, you'll see the straight line from the Marquesas going all the way up to the Hawaiian Islands. Those were the first people who came to settle the Hawaiian Islands. And then later on, you'll see the straight line from the Society Islands, from Tahiti, also going up to the Hawaiian Islands. A little bit closer shot of the French Polynesian Islands. How many of you during your time in Hawaii heard of the menehune? Did anyone hear of the menehune? A couple of people. The menehune, for those of you who are, it'd be like little gnomes, little elves, little leprechauns, if you will. But they're called little people, so they would be people that we would consider dwarfs or midgets, but they were little fairy-type people. Now, we hear this word and we think, how did they come up with this story? And the reason that we have this story is because from Polynesia, the island of Tahiti, they actually fought a people called the Manahune. And these were people that they conquered and they enslaved. And so in a way of saying to them, not only were they people of little stature, they were just people who were little in their mind, much like when European cultures enslaved African cultures, they considered them less than human, less than themselves. So they called them little people. Well, when the Europeans came and they heard these stories, they thought that the land was filled with fictional, little mythical people, little fairies that helped create all of these great areas. So you'll see Menehune roads, you'll see the Menehune ditch, you'll see platforms that were made by the Menehune. But really what it was the enslaved people. It was these people who were so small in the minds of the Tahitians that they were enslaved and then forced to build all of these areas. So when the Hawaiians learned that this is what the Europeans thought of this, they didn't correct them. They just continued to build it into their stories. So now, even in Hawaiian mythology, they'll talk about some of the fairies and the things that were done by the Menehune. But really, it's just a misunderstanding of the phrase. And instead of being people of little status, it became people of little stature. So here's a Menehune ditch on Kauai. This was used to bring water from the river to the crops. And it's very interesting because by the time that the Hawaiian culture developed, what we know as Hawaiian culture, they really had very little knowledge of how to work stone. And yet this culture before them built these amazing, amazing structures out of stone. Huge platforms that were altars with houses that they would set up near the ocean as ceremonial platforms. And then you have these ditches and highways, all of these things that were built out of stone, and yet the Polynesian people as we know them today had no knowledge or understanding of the stonework. So again, this brings in some of the ideas of the connections between Latin America, between the ancient Peruvians and the Incas, that there's thought that they may have traded and had cultural similarities because they came across the waters from Peru to the Society Islands in the South Pacific. And some of these could have been brought up to do some of this stonework as well. It's not really a scientific belief, but it's a way of helping understand how these things were built. Now we'll talk a little bit about the Hawaiian Chiefs. Everything that we know about Hawaii today was told to us because of the chiefs. The chiefs were responsible for telling the stories of their people. So in every single society, these chiefs would tell their story. They would tell how they were related to the gods. So we think, how do they come to know this? How does a chief understand that he's related to a god? Well, the only reason he is a chief is because he would be a direct descendant of a god. And he was said to possess mana, which is a spiritual power. So when we talk about this, I try to draw people's attention to the idea that it's not that similar from our own Judeo-Christian belief that in order to justify Jesus as the Messiah, that we have to connect him first back to the house of David. That it's only by establishing Jesus' genealogy as from the house of David that we're able to really understand, and we have the aha moment that, yes, Jesus must be the Messiah because he comes from the house of David. In the same way, these chieftains would establish a genealogy that would go all the way back to the first man. And so when a new chief would come into power, he would establish himself, much like in the days of the kings. They would establish their patents, their patents of royalty. And they would show then how their genealogy takes them all the way back to the earliest man and then to God directly. So let's talk a little bit about mana and rank in Hawaii. Mana is a type of power, and we'll talk about this more in other lectures. It's a very intense sort of power, so intense, in fact, that if a commoner was to come into the shadow of a Hawaiian king, they would be killed. You were not allowed to be in the shadow. You were not allowed to eat the same food. You were not allowed to be in the same presence of a king or anyone who was considered great. It was only if the king lifted the taboo would you be then able to be in the presence, even near the king. So we'll also talk a little bit about the Hawaiian family. Hawaiians had a very similar structure to what we know of most of Polynesia. It was a matriarchal society. And one of the things I think is very interesting is when we talk about the ancient Hawaiians and how they disciplined their children. There was no such thing as violence. There was no such thing as beating your child down with any sort of physical. There was no discussion or belittling of the child to discipline them. When a child acted inappropriately, the tribe did one thing. They ignored him. They ignored the child. And it was only until the child recognized that they had done something wrong that they were allowed back in the tribe. So they would say nothing, but at mealtime, if the child had done something wrong, there would be no place set at the table or on the floor for the child. Their bed would have been given to another person for the evening. They wouldn't be allowed inside of the house. And they would be cast out from all of society. And this level of ostracism was tantamount to death in Polynesian cultures. So if a teenager didn't get his act together, didn't become a part of the tribe, didn't become a part of the culture, he was cast out. And in many respects, that's where the new islands were formed. A child who had been thrown out would get into a boat and look for another place to live. But in many respects, it's what preserved the culture as we know it, because you had to think about the tribe. If you didn't put the tribe above your own personal needs, the tribe would die. And they recognized this very early on and established in the family and in the community that the tribe must come first, that there were no individual rights unless the rights of the tribe were first seen. Hawaiians also have had what's very similar to the Indian culture, a caste system, similar to the Hindus of India. People were born into specific castes, and social mobility was very, very rare. We'll talk a little bit about the rest of these, but as you can see, that there were different castes. You have the Kahuna, the Maka'aina, and the Kawe. And the Kawe were really the lowest possible caste. They were often used and justified for use in human sacrifice. So whenever there was a sacrifice to Pele, the goddess of the volcanoes, it was the lowest class that was often sacrificed. Now we talk about surfing being an important sport for the Polynesians, but it was actually warfare that was the great sport for the Polynesians. They were very much involved and if they got bored, they would go to war. If they found that their islands were being overpopulated, they would send off warring troops and look for another island. If they were finding a lack of food, they would go to war. So they looked for almost any opportunity to go to war. And also keep in mind that this was how they expanded their kingdoms. And it's also how they protected their kingdoms, because they knew that inasmuch as they had found these islands, other people would also come and find them. And that if they didn't defend them, that they would be very likely to be overruled and decimated, much like they had decimated the first people. Food and hospitality, for any of you who spent any time with Polynesian families, is very, very important. It's a lesson that I learned early on, was to not schedule too many family visits in Polynesia on one day, because they would anticipate your arrival, they would wait for you, and they would have a huge meal prepared, and if you didn't eat everything, they would consider it almost an insult. So even if they didn't have much, they would give you almost everything that they had. And after 3 or 4 times visiting families in one day, it can be exhausting. Because you're full, you can't possibly eat anymore, and yet you feel that you have to eat in order to keep up and to not offend them. So food is still very important, and it's still a way, for example, the luau is meant to honor cherished guests. And that's why when people come, it still is great Hawaiian tradition to honor guests by having a luau. Cannibalism. So while we're on the subject of food, let's talk a little bit about cannibalism. Cannibalism was not practiced in Hawaii. Most people think that cannibalism was practiced in Hawaii because it was practiced in many parts of the Polynesian island group. But in Hawaii, it was actually not practiced. What they would do instead, so when Captain Cook was killed, they thought, when they came back, they asked for the body. And they said, so was Captain Cook actually cooked? And he wasn't. What they had done was they had taken his body and they had stripped off all of the bones, stripped out all of the meat and the bones, all of the flesh from his body. And they took the flesh and they took the small bones and they dumped them out to sea for the fish to eat. But then what they did was they would clean those bones and they would dust them, they would powder them, but they took the biggest bones, and the biggest bones were thought to have held all of the mana, all of the power. And so because Captain Cook was perceived as a great chief, even though he was killed, they respected him. So when the Europeans came back and asked for the body, they presented them with a box full of bones. And the bones were polished, they were sparkling almost, because they had taken such great care to preserve these bones, because they knew that the people would be coming back for their God. So while cannibalism was not practiced, they did practice the power of they did have the practice of taking care of the bones. And in much the same way, we take a look at our Polynesian, the Polynesian counterparts, which would be to Christianity. Take a look at how we reflect and how we value the bones of our saints. For those of you who come from a Christian tradition, the bones of saints are often cut into smaller pieces and used in reliquaries. They're revered. They're signs of the great power of these men of God. But also consider that throughout most of Polynesia, cannibalism was practiced. And cannibalism was practiced for a couple of reasons. It was practiced to show reverence, to take the body, so the major organs that would be filled with the manna, their power, and they would take these and they would eat them. So on a field of battle, a chief would often, they would have one of their underlings would hold the other chief, and they would go in with a dagger, and I'll show you this dagger in a future lecture, but they would cut out the heart of the chief, and they would eat it on the battlefield. And it was meant so that the other chief would obtain the power from the other chief. No one else was allowed to kill or to eat the organs of a chief, only another chief. So consequently, you would get the manna, the physical and spiritual power, by eating the organs of another great man. And in the same way, what they would do is, if there was a man who was not a good chief, who was an evil chief, even if they respected each other, but there were men who were simply not qualified to be chiefs, they would take the heart and the organs and they would feed them to the dogs. So that way, these organs would never again, the manna, the spiritual power, be it negative spiritual power, would never again be in humanity. It would be gone. It would be destroyed. And so whenever I talk about this idea of cannibalism, I get people going, oh, that's disgusting. I can't imagine any religion or any culture that would eat the body and blood of its own leader. And yet, what we do in our own religions, for those of us who are Christian, and the very practice of the Eucharist and the Mass, we ceremonially eat the body and the blood of our Savior Jesus Christ. Now, why is that? They would say it's about doing this in memory of the Last Supper, but traditionally the reason this is because these ancient tribes, of which Jesus was also a part of the Judeo tribes, believed also that there was great power that was passed along through people. And that by consuming, by taking this part of this person into you, you were sharing in the life and the glory and the spiritual power of this leader. So in many respects, what I try to show is that these ancient religions, these ancient rites and ancient practices in Polynesia and around the world, that we take a look at these ideas of cannibalism, and they're not so far from our own religious beliefs. And it helps us better understand how we came to where we are today and why it's important to respect and honor and understand even those distant myths that don't bear a lot of semblance to our own. In future lectures, we're going to be talking more about the stories of the mythologies of Polynesia. We'll also be talking about New Zealand. We'll be talking a little bit more about the island formations, all the way to the Aborigines of Australia. I have a total of 7 lectures, so I hope that you'll come back and hear the following lectures. But until then, thank you very much for taking the time to come out and learn a little bit about Hawaii today. Thank you.
Wa una na